Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform, American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStax American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on federal, state, and local power. The core question is this: who actually commands when national supremacy, state police power, and local implementation collide over one public problem? The core competency is to contrast the powers and responsibilities of federal, state, and local governments.
Who actually commands when Washington claims supremacy, a state invokes its police power, and a city or county has to carry the order out with its own budget and personnel? That is the operational question inside American federalism. The Constitution does not place every public problem in one box. It spreads authority vertically, then forces officials to argue over borders, funding, enforcement, and blame when the same policy field touches all three levels at once. Federalism divides power among national, state, and local institutions, but those institutions do not stand on equal constitutional footing. The national government receives enumerated powers from the Constitution. States retain broad governing authority because they existed before the Constitution and kept what they did not surrender. Local governments usually exist because state law charters them, funds them, limits them, merges them, or abolishes them. A city can collect public anger daily while still lacking full legal independence from the state that created it. That arrangement is tested most when problems cross borders. Immigration, disaster response, pandemic management, school standards, transportation, and environmental regulation all spill beyond one jurisdiction. Congress can write national rules, but governors may control emergency authority. Attorneys general may sue, county clerks may process the paperwork, and local police or health departments may face the public consequences first. The constitutional question is therefore inseparable from the administrative question. Federal, state, and local power remain contested because each level protects something valuable. National power can coordinate and impose uniform rights. State power can preserve regional judgment and local experimentation. Local authority can respond quickly to lived conditions. The same distribution can also scatter responsibility so effectively that citizens know whom to blame only after the damage has already been done. The framers built federalism out of dissatisfaction with the Articles of Confederation and fear of centralized rule. Under the Articles, Congress could request money and troops from the states, but could not reliably compel either. The Constitution corrected that weakness by giving Congress direct authority over taxation, borrowing, commerce, war, and national finance. It did not create a general police power for the national government. That omission proved consequential. Health, safety, welfare, family law, most criminal law, and ordinary local governance remain primarily with the states. The text of the Constitution distributes this system through several clauses rather than one sentence. Article 1 enumerates national powers. The necessary and proper clause allows Congress to choose means suited to carrying those powers into execution. The supremacy clause in Article 6 gives valid federal law priority when state and federal rules cannot coexist. The 10th Amendment, ratified in 1791, reserves undelegated powers to the states or the people. The structure therefore creates tension by design. One clause expands operational capacity, while another warns that not every useful policy belongs to the nation. Local governments enter the system through state law, not directly through the federal Constitution. Counties often serve as state administrative arms for courts, records, jails, elections, and road systems. Municipal governments handle zoning, policing, utilities, fire protection, code enforcement, transit, and schools through powers granted in charters or statutes. Under Dillon's rule, named for Iowa Judge John F. Dillon in the 19th century, local governments possess only the powers expressly granted by the state, powers fairly implied, and powers essential to the locality's declared purposes. Some states later adopted home rule provisions to give municipalities broader discretion, but even home rule exists because state constitutions or statutes allow it. The early republic showed why these boundaries would remain unstable. Alexander Hamilton's financial program depended on a national bank and credible national credit. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison worried that broad readings of implied power would swallow state authority. Commerce disputes on rivers, roads, and ports kept raising the question of what counted as interstate activity and what remained local. The constitutional map existed from 1788 forward, but the meaning of that map depended on courts, Congress, state legislatures, governors, and local administrators fighting over specific institutions and specific policies. Industrialization and national markets widened the argument. Railroads crossed state lines. Corporations operated in multiple jurisdictions. Labor conflicts in one state affected prices and supply elsewhere. By the 20th century, New Deal officials argued that a national economy required national regulation of banking, labor standards, securities, agriculture, and industrial production. States still governed broad domestic life, but Washington increasingly used the Commerce Clause, taxing power, and spending power to influence conduct on the ground. Federal grants and aid, highway funds, education dollars, Medicaid formulas, and emergency assistance later deepened that dependence. The older constitutional question survived inside a newer fiscal reality. Who decides when federal money arrives with conditions attached and local governments cannot function without it? Cooperative federalism grew out of that dependence. Congress increasingly wrote statutes that set national baselines and then asked state agencies or local systems to help administer them. Environmental law, highway safety, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food assistance, and election administration all demonstrate the model. The national government defines major conditions, reporting rules, eligibility standards, or enforcement targets. The states build agencies, hire personnel, collect data, and negotiate waivers. Local offices then become the visible site where citizens encounter the rule. This structure can spread expertise and funding. It can also leave citizens facing an official with little power to change the rule, but full responsibility to explain it. Real constitutional pressure arrived in cases and funding systems. In McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, Congress had chartered the Second Bank of the United States to stabilize public finance, collect revenue, hold deposits, and support borrowing. Maryland tried to tax the Baltimore branch. That move proved consequential because a tax can be used as a revenue device or as a weapon. If states could burden federal instruments they disliked, then national powers would exist in text while states decided whether those powers could function in practice. Chief Justice John Marshall answered that Congress could create the bank as a means plainly adapted to its enumerated fiscal powers, and that Maryland could not tax the bank because the states may not control or destroy a legitimate federal instrument. 5 years later. Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824 widened the national operating room further. New York had granted Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston an exclusive steamboat monopoly in its waters, and Aaron Ogden sued Thomas Gibbons for operating under a federal coastal license. Marshall treated navigation as part of commerce and held that Congress could regulate interstate commercial activity that moved across state lines. The case did not erase all state authority over internal affairs, but it established that state-created economic privileges could fail when they collided with valid federal commercial regulation. Those decisions did not settle the system. They made the system usable. Congress still had to write statutes. Presidents still had to enforce them. States still kept their own taxing systems, police powers, licensing rules, election administration, school systems, and criminal codes. Federalism became a working machine because each level possessed real tools, not because the boundaries were tidy. Money turned out to be one of the strongest tools. Congress can influence state and local behavior through grants. Categorical grants direct money towards specified purposes and often come with detailed conditions. Block grants provide broader spending discretion inside a policy area. Unfunded mandates reverse the pressure by requiring compliance without covering the full cost. Highway funds tied to drinking age policy, education funds tied to disability and civil rights compliance, Medicaid dollars tied to eligibility rules, and Homeland Security grants tied to preparedness standards all show how fiscal leverage can shape state and local choices without formally abolishing local authority. Local officials live at the end of that chain. County clerks run elections under state law while complying with federal voting rights rules. Sheriffs manage jails under county budgets, while state sentencing rules and federal detention requests alter the population inside. School districts answer to local boards, state standards, and federal special education or civil rights mandates simultaneously. Public health departments can receive federal guidance from the CDC, state emergency directives from a governor, and local outrage from residents in the same week. The nearest office to the public often has the narrowest range of constitutional independence. Emergency management makes the structure plain. During a major hurricane, the city may order evacuations or open shelters. The county may handle debris and local law enforcement coordination. The governor may declare a statewide emergency and mobilize the National Guard. And the federal government may release FEMA assistance after statutory triggers are met. During a pandemic, state police powers can close schools and businesses. Federal agencies can issue guidance and distribute funds. And local health systems must still find beds, staff, and protective equipment. When reimbursement formulas lag or rules conflict, federalism stops looking like civics vocabulary and starts looking like a fight over whose signature is missing from the form that people need right now. Preemption disputes show the same structure in slower motion. Congress may expressly preempt state law, occupy a field so completely that states are displaced, or create conflict. Preemption, where compliance with both systems becomes impossible. States then answer by preempting their own cities on firearms, minimum wage ordinances, housing rules, voting administration, or public health measures. The hierarchy repeats at each layer. A city that wants stricter tenant protections or different policing rules may discover that the state legislature has already stripped that discretion away. A state that wants its own immigration enforcement model may discover that federal supremacy blocks the move. The formal diagram of federalism looks stable on paper, while the practical authority keeps shifting through litigation, appropriations riders, agency guidance, and emergency orders. Marshall's opinion in McCulloch was written for a real institutional fight, not a seminar. Congress had chartered a bank. Maryland wanted leverage over the branch within its borders. Marshall chose words that would keep the national government operational. "Let the end be legitimate," he wrote, "then let the means be appropriate and plainly adapted to that end." Those phrases carry force because they reject a cramped reading of enumerated powers that would allow Congress to raise revenue and borrow money in theory while denying it the instruments needed to do either reliably. The opinion hardens further when Marshall addresses Maryland's tax. States tax all the time, which is exactly why the line had to be drawn sharply. The power to tax involves the power to destroy is not theatrical excess. It is a warning about hierarchy. If a state can tax a federal instrument because it dislikes the policy it carries, then supremacy becomes conditional on state permission. Marshall's pen therefore turns a revenue dispute into a constitutional command about which level can choke the other. That source language still carries force because it solves one problem by intensifying another. Marshall made national powers administratively usable. He did not define a final stopping point. Every later fight over commerce, spending conditions, preemption, sanctuary policies, environmental regulation, marijuana enforcement, education standards, and disaster response returns to the same pressure. When does national capacity become national overreach, and how much room remains for states and the local governments they create when federal law arrives, with money, deadlines, and a threat of preemption behind it? The same federalism that protects liberty also distributes conflict so widely that accountability can become difficult to pin down. The national government can say a problem requires uniform rules. A state can answer that Washington is shifting costs downward while claiming the credit upward. A city can answer that both higher levels made the choice, while local agencies must face the families, workers, patients, and voters who absorb the result first. That is why federalism does not end with a list of powers. It persists as a live constitutional contest over who may decide, who must implement, and who must pay. If the nation pushes too far, state authority starts to look ceremonial. If the states push too far, national rights become geography. If local governments are denied room to adapt, practical administration breaks under rules written far away. If local governments get too much room, equality and uniform protection may fracture from county line to county line. The unresolved pressure is easy to state and hard to solve. When one public problem sits in all three jurisdictions at once, which level should lose authority first when the commands conflict and the consequences are already falling on people who cannot wait for another round of constitutional theory?
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.